to say, I will skip it or change the words. And if that's not okay with you, well then don't watch this video. I'm just letting you know because I don't want to get demonetized. And I'm gonna go with what my comfort level is. That being said, let's get started, okay? Alright, Chapter 1. Mr. Winterborne, a woman is here to see you. Sorry, that's my stomach. Rhys looked up from the stack of letters on his desk with a scowl. His personal secretary, Mrs. Fernsby, I love it, stood at the threshold of his private office, her eyes sharp behind round spectacles. She was a tidy hen of a woman, middle-aged and just a bit plump. Plump, 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 plump. You know, I don't receive visitors at this hour. At this hour. It was his morning ritual to spend the first half hour of the day reading mail in uninterrupted silence. Yes, sir, but the visitor is a lady. And I don't care if she's the bloody queen, he snapped. Send her away. Sorry, my stomach again. Mrs. Fernsby. Mrs. Fernsby's lips pinched into a disapproving hyphen. She left promptly, the heels of her shoes hitting the floor like the staccato of gunfire. Reese returned his attention to the letter. Returned to the letter in front of him. Losing his temper was a luxury he rarely permitted himself, but for the past week, he'd been invaded by a sullen gloom that weighted every thought and heartbeat, and made him want to lash out at anyone within reach. All because a woman he had known better than to want. Lady Helen Ravenel, a woman who was cultured, innocent, shy, aristocratic, everything he was not, and every stereotype we have. Their engagement had lasted a mere 2 weeks before Reese had managed to ruin it. The last time he had seen Helen, he'd been impatient and aggressive, finally kissing her the way he'd wanted to for so long. She'd gone stiff in his arms, she rejected him. Her disdain couldn't have been more obvious. The scene had ended in tears on her part, anger on his. The next day, Kathleen Lady Trenier, who had been married to Helen's late brother, had come to inform him that Helen was so distressed she was bedridden with a migraine. She never wants to see you again, Kathleen had informed him bluntly, which is not her business, and she's super annoying in this part, but you know, that's my opinion. notes say. How had the visitor made it past the outer offices? He paid a small army of people to prevent him from having to deal with this kind of interruption. An absurd idea occurred to him, and although he dismissed it immediately, his pulse quickened. What does she look like? He brought himself to ask. She's dressed in mourning with a veil over her face, slender of build and soft-spoken. After a brief hesitation, she added on a dry note, "The accent is pure drawing room." As realization dawned, Reese felt his chest close around a deep stab of yearning. Whatever that means. I'm sorry, I don't speak Welsh. He muttered. It didn't seem possible that Helen would have come to him, but somehow he knew she had. He knew it down to his marrow. Without another word, he stood and moved past Mrs. Fernsby with ground-eating strides. "Mr. Winterborne," the secretary exclaimed, following him. "You're in your shirt sleeves. Your coat." Reese scarcely heard her as he left his corner suite office and entered a foyer with leather-upholstered chairs. He halted abruptly at the sight of the visitor, his breath catching sharp and quick. Even though the mourning veil concealed Helen's face, he recognized her perfect posture and the willowy slenderness of her form. He forced himself to close the distance between them. Unable to say a word, he stood in front of her, nearly choking with resentment, and yet breathing in her sweet scent with helpless greed. He was instantly aroused by her presence. From one of the rooms attached to the foyer, the tappity-tap of typewriting machines stuttered into silence. It was madness for Helen to have come here unescorted. Oh, God. Her reputation would be destroyed. She had to be removed from the foyer and sent home before anyone realized whom she was. I have to protect her kind of crap. But first, Reese had to find out what she wanted. Although she was sheltered and innocent, she wasn't a fool. She wouldn't have taken such enormous risk without good reason. He glanced at Mrs. Fernsby. "My guests will be leaving soon. In the meantime, make certain we're not disturbed." "Yes, sir." His gaze returned to Helen. "Come," he said gruffly, and led the way to his office. She accompanied him wordlessly, her skirts rustling as they brushed the sides of the hallway. Her garments were outdated and slightly shabby. The look of gentility fallen on hard times. Was that why she was here? Was the Ravenals family's need for money so desperate that she had to change her mind about lowering herself to become his wife? By God, Reese thought with grim anticipation, he would love for her to beg him to take her back. He wouldn't, of course. But he'd give her a taste of the torment he had endured for the past week. Anyone who had ever dared to cross him would have assured her that there would be no forgiveness or mercy afterward. They entered his office, a spacious and quiet place with wide double-glazed windows and thick, soft carpeting in the center of the room. A walnut pedestal desk had been piled with stacks of correspondence and files. After closing the door, Reese went to his desk, picked up an hourglass, and upended it. In a deliberate gesture, the sandwood drained to the lower chamber in precisely 15 minutes. He felt the need to make the point that they were in his world now, where time mattered and he was in control. So full of himself. He turned to Helen with a mocking lift of his brows. "I was told last week that you..." But his voice died away as Helen pushed back her veil and stared at him with the patient, tender gravity that had devastated him from the first. Her eyes were the silver blue of clouds, Gav leaned against his desk, folding his arms across his chest. "You don't have much time," he said, stonily, giving a short nod toward the hourglass. "You'd better make use of it." Helen sat in the chair, arranged her skirts, and removed her gloves, with deft tugs at the fingertips. Reese's mouth went dry at the sight of her delicate fingers emerging from the black gloves. She had played the piano for him at Eversby Priory, her family's estate. He had been fascinated by the agility of her hands, darting and swooping over the keys like small white birds. For some reason, she was still wearing the betrothal ring he'd given her, the flawless rose-cut diamond catching briefly on the glove. After pushing back her veil so that it fell down her back in a dark mist of fabric, Helen dared to meet his gaze for a charged moment. Soft color infused her cheeks. "Mr. Winterborne, I didn't ask my sister-in-law to visit you last week. I wasn't feeling well at the time, but had I known what Kathleen intended." She said you were ill. My head ached. That was all. It seems I was the cause. Kathleen made far too much of it. According to her, you said you never wanted to see me again. Her blush deepened to brilliant rose. "I wish she hadn't repeated that," she exclaimed, looking vexed and ashamed. "I didn't mean it. My head was splitting, and I was trying to make sense of what had happened the day before, when you visited, and..." She tore her gaze from his and looked down at her lap, the light from the windows sliding over her hair. The clasp of her hands was tight and slightly rounded, as if she held something fragile between her palms. "I need to talk to you about that," she said quietly. "I want very much to reach an understanding with you." Something inside him died. Reese had been approached for money, but by too many people not to recognize what was coming. Helen was no different from anyone else, trying to gain some advantage for herself. Although he couldn't blame her for that, he couldn't bear hearing whatever rationale she had come up with for how much he owed her and why. He would rather pay her off immediately and be done with it. God knew why he'd nourished some faint, foolish hope that she might have wanted anything from him other than money. This was how the world had always worked, and always would. Men sought beautiful women, and women traded their beauty for wealth. He had debased Helen by putting his inferior paws on her, and now she would demand restitution. Sorry for the noise. My house is making a lot of noise right now, and there's nothing I can do about it. I can keep pausing, but it just drags on my recording. Anyways, God knew why he'd nourished some faint, foolish hope that she might have wanted anything from him than money. This was how the world had always worked and always would. Sorry about that. He walked around to the other side of his desk, pulled out a drawer, and withdrew a checkbook for a private account. Taking up a pen, he wrote an order for £10,000. After making a note on the left margin of the book for his own reference, he walked back around to Helen and gave it to her. "There's no need for anyone to know where it came from," he said in a business-like tone. "If you don't have a banking account, I'll see that one is open for you. No bank would allow a woman to establish an account for herself. I promise it will be handled discreetly." Helen stared at him with bewilderment and then glanced at the check. "Why would you?" She drew in a swift breath as she saw the amount. Her horrified gaze flew back to his. "Why?" she asked, her breath coming in agitated bursts. Puzzled by her reaction, Reese frowned. "You said you wanted to reach an understanding. That's what it means." "No, I meant that I wanted for us to understand each other." She fumbled to tear the check into tiny pieces. "I don't need money, and even if I did, I would never ask you for it." Bits of paper flew through the air like snowflakes. Stunned, he watched her make short work of the small fortune he'd just given her. A mixture of frustration and embarrassment filled him as he realized that he'd misread her. What the hell did she want from him? Why was she there? Helen took a long breath and another, slowly reinflating her composure. She stood and approached him. There's been something of a windfall at my family's estate. We now have means to provide dowries for me and my sisters. Reese stared at her, his face a hard mask while his brain struggled to take in what she was saying. She had come too close. The light fragrance of her vanilla and orchids stole into his lungs with every breath. His body coursed with heat. He wanted her on her back, across his desk. Sorry. With an effort, he shoved this image away. Here in the business-like surroundings of his office, dressed in civilized clothing and polished Oxford shoes, he had never felt like more of a brute. Desperate to establish even a small measure of distance, he retreated and encountered the edge of the desk. He was forced to resume a half-sitting position, while Helen continued to advance until her skirts brushed against his leg. She could have been a figure in a Welsh fairy tale, a nymph who had formed from the mist of a lake. There was something otherworldly about the delicacy of her porcelain skin, and the resting contrast between her dark lashes and brows and her silver blonde hair, and those eyes, cool translucence contained in dark rims. She'd said something about a windfall. What did that mean? An unexpected inheritance, a gift. Perhaps a lucrative investment, although that was unlikely in light of the Ravenal family's notorious fiscal irresponsibility. Whatever manner of windfall it was, Helen seemed to believe that her family's financial troubles were over. If that were true, then any man in London would be hers for the choosing. She had put her future at risk coming to him. Her reputation was at stake. Anything could have happened. The only thing keeping her safe was the fact that Reese had no wish to destroy something as lovely and fragile as this woman. Again, back to that fragile woman trope. And Beauty and the Beast. Sorry. For her sake, he had removed her from Winterborne's as quickly and discreetly as possible. With an effort, he looked over her head and focused on a distant point on the wood-paneled wall. I'll escort you from the building. Through a private exit, he muttered. You'll return home with no one the wiser. I will not release you from our engagement, Helen said gently. His gaze shot back to hers, while another of those deep stabs sank into his chest. Helen didn't even blink, only waited patiently for his response. My lady, we both know that I'm the last man you want to marry. From the beginning, I've seen your disgust of me. Disgust. Insulted by her feigned surprise, he continued savagely. You shrink away from my touch. You won't speak to me at dinner. Most of the time, you can't even bring yourself to look at me. And when I kissed you last week, you pulled away and burst into tears. He would have expected Helen to be ashamed at being called out in a lie. Instead, she stared at him earnestly, her lips parted in dismay. Please, she eventually said, you must forgive me. I'm far too shy. I must work harder to overcome it. When I behave that way, it has nothing at all to do with disgust. The truth is, I'm nervous with you because a deep flush worked up from the high neck of her dress to the edge of her hairline, because you're very attractive. She continued awkwardly and worldly, and I don't wish for you to think me foolish. As for the other day, that was my first kiss. I didn't know what to do and I felt quite overwhelmed. Somewhere in the chaos fine manner or good breeding. There were permanent calluses on his hands from years of building crates and loading merchandise onto delivery wagons. He was easily twice Helen's weight and as muscular as a bull, and if he rutted, holy hell, what had he been thinking in the first place? He should never have let himself even consider the idea of marrying her. But he had been too blinded by his own ambition and by Helen's sweetness and fine-spun beauty to fully consider the consequences. For her, bitter with the awareness of his own limitations, he said in a low voice, "It's water under the bridge, it is. Soon you'll have your first season and you'll meet the man you were meant for. The devil knows it's not me." He began to stand, but Helen moved even closer. The hesitant pressure of her hand on his chest sent him with the feeling of desire. Reese sank back to the desk weakly, all his strength focusing on maintaining his crumbling self-control. That stuff kind of annoys me anyways. He was a terrifying hair's breadth away from God knows what. "Will you kiss me again?" she asked. He shut his eyes, panting furious with her. What a joke fate had played on him, throwing this fragile creature into his path to punish him for climbing higher than he'd been meant to remind him of what he could never become. That's my dog in the background. "I can't be a gentleman," he said hoarsely, "not even for you. You don't have to be a gentleman, only gentle." No one had ever asked him for such a thing. To his despair, he realized it wasn't in him. His hands gripped the edges of the desk until the wood threatened to crack. "Cariad, there's nothing gentle about how I want you." He was startled by the endearment that had slipped out, one he had never used with anyone. He felt Helen touch his jaw, her fingertips delicate spots of cool fire on his skin. "Just try," he heard her whisper. "For me," and her soft mouth pressed against his.